Let's talk about that time in the Hebrew Bible when the God of Israel lost in battle to the God of another nation.
So, unlike my previous response videos, I'm going to speedrun his video because he gives some context, which I am very surprised by, but then ignores other contexts. Nonetheless, I'll let Dan give you the context because he explains a lot that I don't need to comment on. If you enjoy content like this, where I take a look at claims made about Christianity and see what scripture and logic has to say, drop a like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Now let's see if God really lost to Chemosh. Welcome to Veritas.
Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and we're talking about 2 Kings chapter 3, and there are a lot of interesting parallels between what goes on in 2 Kings 3 and what goes on in 2 Kings 18 and 19, and we'll get to that in a moment.
It is interesting, though it might be a little anticlimactic for Mr. Scholar. One thing to keep in mind is that although he gives some context to the battle and where we are in the biblical history of Israel, he fails to give context when it really matters. I'll explain that at the end of the video.
But to begin, the whole conflict begins with the death of the king of Israel, Ahab, and then the rise to the throne of his son, Jehoram.
Sorry, but I'm going to speed it up more. Check the link to his original video below if you want to see the entirety of it.
Now, this transition of power is a wonderful opportunity for nations that are under vassalage to revolt, because the new king has not yet established his authority and legitimacy. And so this is the weakest period of the sovereign nation. And so King Mesha, the king in Moab, decides to revolt, because up until that time, Moab had been a vassal to the northern king of Israel. And so Jehoram recruits Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, as well as the king of Edom, to engage in a campaign to return Moab to vassalage. So they invade Moab, but they don't get very far, and after about a week, they have to retreat and regroup. And this is when they bring in Elisha, the Yahwistic prophet, who seeks the aid of Adonai. And Elisha says that Adonai will deliver Moab into the coalition's hand, which is an unambiguous prophecy of total victory. They will restore Moab to vassalage. That's what that prophecy means. Now, they are given instructions on how they're to engage in this invasion, and so they head off and they invade Moab.
Okay, so with that out of the way, Israel has thus far been successful. However, an important point to make is that Elisha had made a prophecy about the outcome of this battle. He said in 2 Kings 3 verse 18 that God would give Moab into the hands of the coalition. Another interesting thing here is that the Mesha stele actually confirms these events as historical, including the kings, the coalition, and the partial victory, then defeat of Israel.
Defend the city from the invading coalition. And the king sees an opportunity maybe to try to break through the line to get to the king of Edom, but they are unsuccessful. And then in 2 Kings 3:27, it says that the king offered his heir to the throne as a burnt offering on the city wall, a human sacrifice. And the very next words are, there was great fury against Israel, and they left off from against him and returned to the land. In other words, they retreated. Moab successfully threw off vassalage, and the coalition was unsuccessful in returning Moab to vassalage.
So far, he has been extremely accurate, almost down to the exact biblical wording. However, the problem comes again, not from the text, but what Dan reads into the text. Let me show you. I'm skipping a chunk of his video because he just unnecessarily explains why the retreat is seen as a loss, because the same Hebrew words are used in
2 Kings 18 and 19.
We don't need that, so we'll just assume that Israel lost. We can also see that on the Mesha stele. So Dan continues.
They were able to drive off the invasion without being returned to vassalage. The same is going on in 2 Kings 3. Only instead of the messenger of Adonai destroying 185,000 troops, as we see in 2 Kings 18 and 19, what happens in 2 Kings 3 is the result of the king trying to offer his son as a burnt offering. There was great fury against Israel, so they retreated. What's that great fury? Well, the word there in Hebrew is ketzef gadol. And ketzef is only ever used in historical narrative prose, which is what we have going on here, to refer to divine fury.
Well, this is a lie. To define a lie, it's something that doesn't conform to reality. As a scholar, Dan is supposed to know that saying is only ever used in, regardless of clarifying that it's a historical narrative prose, because even then, it's demonstrably false. That same Hebrew word is also used in Esther, which is a historical narrative prose, to refer to human fury, not just divine fury or wrath. So Dan is overstating the fact, so that his broader point can land harder. However, by doing this, he's actually resting his entire premise on a faulty hinge, once again.
Now, in all the other occurrences, it's referring to Adonai's fury against Israel. However, here, that's not a rational reading of what's going on. That's not a plausible interpretation, because there's absolutely no reason for Adonai to suddenly be furious with Israel as a result of the king of Moab offering his son as a human sacrifice upon the city wall. Critical scholars fairly widely agree that what's going on here is the sacrifice worked because it catalyzed the intervention of Moab's patron deity, which was Chemosh. And the great fury against Israel really has to have been Chemosh's fury. There's no other plausible way to account for this series of events.
Do I need to remind the audience that Dan is a scholar? I have never heard a scholar sound so sure about anything, claiming that there is no other plausible explanation. It has to be Chemosh's fury. He said it's fairly widely agreed to mean, which isn't true. The majority of scholarship do not say that. Dan often uses certain words to even more inflate his position, such as widely, because that gives him wiggle room to excuse his phrasing by shielding himself with, I said widely, not majority. Yeah, well, I don't really care, especially not if you purposefully use ambiguous words.
Other than to suggest that the author of 2 Kings 3 is representing the failure of this coalition to reestablish vassalage of Moab as a product of the patron deity of Moab driving the forces out. In other words, Adonai left home court advantage and lost. Now, Adonai promised through the prophet Elisha that Moab would be delivered into the hand of the coalition. Again, that is an unambiguous prophecy about returning Moab to vassalage. If not that, it must at very least refer to the recouping of the costs of the invasion. And we have zero evidence that either of those things actually happened. The most likely interpretation of the text as it stands is that the prophecy failed because Adonai invaded another nation and was routed by the patron deity of that nation, who intervened following the king's offering of his heir to the throne as a human sacrifice, as a burnt offering.
That's the final piece I'm playing of his video, because the rest has no bearing on the text or the situation. I'll handle the prophecy if there is time. Firstly, his argument. God said that Israel will win, then the Moabite king sacrifices his son to Chemosh, then great wrath or fury came against Israel, and the only way to read the text is that Chemosh's wrath or fury routed Yahweh. So here's the crux of the problem. The Hebrew word ketzef godal, which Dan is attempting to mean only divine fury or wrath, even if it tries to play word games, the audience will hear only to mean. It doesn't only apply to divine fury or wrath. Let's take a look at Esther 1 verses 18, which states that, likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard of the deed of the queen. Thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. The word wrath there is the exact same word and noun ketzef, because the verb of the same word is often used for people and others, but the noun overwhelmingly, but not only, means divine wrath. However, in multiple places, not just Esther 1 verse 18, it also refers to human anger. If you consider the psychological state of Israel and the Moabites, that reading becomes just as plausible as the divine wrath reading. At least it doesn't require me to add to the text. It's very plausible to imagine that Israel retreated due to the massive moral boost that the shock and horror of child sacrifice instilled in the Moabite army. So to claim, firstly, that the word is only ever used for anything is wrong and overstated. So the entire claim that Chemosh did anything is reading into the text again. There is no evidence that the wrath came from Chemosh as a separate, distinct supernatural god that routed Yahweh. The second problem is that from Dan's scholarly perspective, he must concede that the Deuteronomistic historian that likely compiled Kings doesn't usually affirm the real power of foreign gods, even if he knows that they are worshipped. Due to a lack of time, go check IP's video on prophecy. I generally agree with him on that. Link will be in the description below. I will also cover the Divine Council in my next video, as that also requires some corrections. But again, we saw Dan consistently read things into the text and overstate his hinging claim. Sadly for Dan, his claim is incorrect, so his entire argument collapses. I don't need to show that it's not talking about Chemosh's wrath or fury. He made the claim. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope I could show again that for Dan, it's not about the data. He has an agenda and he has an extremely strong bias, which I'm hoping to showcase across these various videos. If you believe that I have misrepresented a point, please let me know in the comments down below. I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, drop a like. If you want to see more content like this, subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when I release the next video. Drop a comment down below and let me hear your thoughts on this entire Chemosh situation. As always, remember Acts 17:11. I am Brandon, this was Veritas, and have a blessed rest of the day.